Look, thank you all very much for coming along to this event. This is Melbourne Connect presents Advancing Environmental Sustainability. So before we begin, and for those attending today, we as the presenters on this event acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where we live and work today, those being the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So we pay our respect to elders past and present in this country, which we know as Australia. So my name is Gary Williams. I'm the creative producer of innovation at Melbourne Connect. Melbourne Connect is a forthcoming innovation precinct which will launch at the end of 2020 on the corner of Swanston and Grattan Street. So that will be at the location of the old Royal Women's Hospital. And fundamentally, we run a series of events throughout the year. This particular event was run as a monthly series of breakfasts. I assure you we will gather in person again soon, but for the time being and throughout the foreseeable future, we'll run a series of events online. And the reasoning is to showcase, I guess, a number of people who are experts in particular fields, industries, and so on. And also to give basically a sense of the flavour of the type of content we'll be producing in this forthcoming innovation precinct. What I'm going to do, just for a little bit of context and before introducing all our speakers today, I'm just going to share my screen very quickly, and hopefully this all goes according to plan. It'll allow me to give a little bit of a context for what Melbourne Connect is. So bear with me just 1 second. There we are. Hopefully you can see that in full screen, but essentially we're here for advancing environmental sustainability, one of a series of events which will run monthly. So Melbourne Connect, as I mentioned, is an innovation precinct opening up on the corner of Swanston and Grattan Street. It's very big, it's very large. It'll enclose a number of people within there, both people from university and also from industry. We're going to have some incredible things within there, including Science Gallery, which will be located right on the corner there. The Melbourne School of Engineering will have their place there, and we'll have co-working, a Fab Lab, makerspace, and much, much more. This will be a place to gather, it'll be a place to discuss, connect, and so on. And of course, a place for us to host events and activations. So there's numerous types of these spaces in Melbourne Connect. And as you can see here, this is one example, the Central Oculus area, which will be a public gathering space. Here's another example of I guess the gatherings that we'll have. But this is a highly, highly sustainable building, and we'll talk more about, I guess, environmental sustainability and those sort of factors relating to a built environment in the near future as well. But for today, we're discussing a range of topics related to environmental sustainability, and a very pertinent and relevant discussion, of course. Now, we have with us some fantastic speakers, so thank you all so much for joining us. I'll welcome you to say hello, but what I'll do the formal part, which is read a bit about yourselves from your bios, so you don't have to. But essentially, we'll then dive into the discussion afterwards, and we'll focus on the research and the projects that each of your respective groups are focusing on at this time. So joining us today, we have Dr. Sangeetha Chandrashekeran. I hope I pronounced the surname right. I'm sorry, I'm get a bit tongue-tied on Zoom. But your role is the Deputy Director at the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute. I'm really interested to hear a lot more about that soon. But Sangeetha holds a joint position in MSSI and is a lecturer and researcher in the School of Geography, Faculty of Science at the University of Melbourne. She's an economic geographer with a focus on the political, economic dimensions of environmental change. So thank you so much for joining us. We also have Dr. Gabriel De Silva. He's a senior lecturer in atmospheric science in the Melbourne School of Engineering at University of Melbourne. So essentially his research interests are broadly in the area of energy and the environment, and currently focused on understanding and modelling reaction processes related to the use of biofuels, and that is ethanol, biodiesel, and biomass. So Gabrielle will be explaining a bit more about allowing us to optimise our combustion and thereby supporting the uptake of green renewable energy sources. And we also have Emma Forster. She's doing smart city projects at City of Melbourne. She has a very lengthy and diverse experience spanning marketing, comms and events across the creative tech and startup industries. And she's heavily involved with entrepreneurs throughout our local ecosystem and as currently posted at City of Melbourne. There, she's leading the delivery of the Startup Action Plan with a focus on smart cities, and is going to talk a bit more today about the annual Open Innovation Challenge, which encourages the community to harness data and emerging technology to solve for common urban challenges. I'm just about out of breath with that intro, but thank you all so much for joining us.
Well done, Gaz. Thank you.
I know, it was quite a bit, wasn't it? And one last bit before we kick in, we also have Zara Zainal joining us on the call. Hi, Zara. Zara is going to be producing a graphic recording today. So a very fantastic storytelling tool that we utilise in-person and online events. We had Zara participate in producing a graphic recording in our last event called the Connected You with some representatives from the university. So thank you. Look, I don't want to delay too much, and thank you all very much for joining us. I know it's it's a very incredulous time, and we're becoming both somewhat used to the use of Zoom for these online events, as well as our regular meetings, etc. But many more questions to come, I think. And also, I think we wanted to deliver this question to, I guess, not negate the continuing discussion in society around environmental sustainability, and for many people's purpose in trying to understand a bit more about what is happening behind the closed doors a bit. We're talking about from a research perspective, from a policy perspective, certainly from a projects perspective. And so all of you have a number of initiatives you're involved in at the moment. Did you want to give us all a little brief overview individually of what you're working on currently? Maybe I'll start with you, Sangeetha.
Sure. So I'll speak more about my role at the Melbourne Sustainable Society Initiative Institute, which we call MSSI. MSSI is one of a number of interdisciplinary research institutes that the university has set up to try and overcome the challenges to us coordinating and collaborating better in a truly interdisciplinary fashion. And our focus is on issues of sustainability. So the institute tries to promote the research that is done at the university to strategic decision makers, policy makers, government, industry, community scale, but also to bring the intelligence from those groups into the university so that we can do strategic research that can make a difference. And the work that we do focuses on a number of themes: climate change, sustainable cities, water, and increasingly on food. And we have a real focus on enabling a sustainable society. So particularly bringing out the perspectives of the humanities and the social sciences to look at that kind of societal transformation that needs to occur around sustainability.
Fantastic. So diving in a little bit, particularly, you've mentioned energy, future cities, and of course, climate, and food. Furthermore, so what are some active, ongoing projects right now that you're heavily involved in? Because you also do sit in, I guess, a cross-faculty perspective. So maybe to emphasise a couple of cross-departmental, cross-faculty initiatives going on at the moment.
Sure. Just broadly by way of context, I would say that there's been this increasing recognition, particularly over the last 12 to 18 months, about how stretched our very foundational systems for life are. And there's been a strong response to that. So we've had major events like the series of fish kills that occurred around the Lower Darling River in 2018-19, the summer of bushfires whose ferocity surprised us all. And there's been an increasing call, there's been a number of developments around that. One is a kind of a call for a crisis or emergency framing and for an institutional governance response that adopts this framing. There's also been a lot of work trying to produce positive visions of a sustainable society into the future. So if you think about Ross Garner's work on Australia as an energy superpower, there's also really interesting work going on collaboratively at the university on creating a sustainable Melbourne food bowl. Other things that are going on that I think are really valuable is an increasing recognition, long overdue, of the significance of Indigenous knowledge and how it can really help us to not just address sustainability challenges, but how central issues of reconciliation are to a fundamental sustainable society going forwards. And lots of community-led initiatives and increasing awareness of the role of local government in particular, and that they can play in the sustainable transition. So with that as a background, some of the projects that we're really interested in, we're doing a lot of collaborative work around the bushfires. So putting in submissions to both the Royal Commission and also to the inquiries, particularly thinking about preventative actions, so in the context of a drying continent, which is climate change affected. There's the broad climate change policies. There's also integrated responses across in terms of emergency management, but also the societal issues of disadvantage that might be driving some of the causes of fires as well. And we're also working on sustainable cities. So we're doing work both in Australia, but also with collaborating with the Connected Cities Lab in the School of Design that looks at some of the innovations that need to happen both in governance and also in practical ways in the Global South to make our cities more sustainable. And then in climate change, we've got a bunch of projects working on things like carbon dioxide removal, so land use changes. And we've also got really interesting projects on climate change and health.
Yeah,
and
wonderful.
Increasingly on issues of climate risk and how finance is starting to take this seriously and what it means to actually operationalize climate risk in finance and industry.
Fantastic. I think I will come back shortly because I was going to ask you around that policy piece. But before I do come back to it a little later, I guess from an interpersonal perspective, how is those conversations from a policy change or policy progression? How is that ramped up or intensified, particularly in the last 12 months that you've sort of recognised? And you've worked within that sort of realm for quite some time. So have you noticed a marked shift in the way things are happening at that sort of bureaucratic level?
So I think there's been a real response from most parts of government to the intensification and the recognition that this is a major crisis.
Yep.
There's been definitely a kind of post-crisis response if you think about the bushfires and what's happening in the Murray-Darling Basin. I guess that work that we need to do that's preparatory and that is preventative to address sustainability broadly and the significance of the transformation, the societal transformation that needs to go on, is something that I think is increasingly being recognised. I think there are still lots of challenges around coordination. At the university, we work too much in silos. In government, there's too much going on in silos. And what we're seeing is that there's just an interdependency with these sustainability issues. We need to think about climate, energy, water as a nexus. We need to think about food and oceans as well. And there are real challenges, institutional challenges for all of us in how to do that. But I think there's increasing recognition that needs to be, that's kind of the frontier of governance for sustainability.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you. I'm not going to, this won't be the last bit we talk about, but what I'll do, I'll get to our others and then we'll come back on a few central points. Dr. De Silva, welcome. Thank you for joining us. So you, I guess, you're here for many reasons, and obviously you are within the Melbourne School of Engineering, particularly focused on atmospheric science. But what was an interesting piece was both what you put out there recently, I guess, definitely related to, well, I'm interested more in your thoughts on whether it was a response to public sentiment that we're in amongst our COVID-19 context, and there's a presumption by some people that is beneficial to our environmental concerns relating to climate change. And I guess you have a lot to say on that matter in direct opposition. But what would you say regarding that the current economic downturn isn't benefiting our environments?
Well, thanks for having me. So where I sit is in chemical engineering in the Melbourne School of Engineering, and the research that I do is to try and understand what is creating the air that we breathe, and what's making the pollutants in the air that we breathe in our cities, around Australia and around the world. So we look at how different pollutants are made in engines, different chemicals that are released industrially, and then what happens to them as they're processed and they come together to form air pollution, which is this worldwide ubiquitous problem. And it's affecting our health, and of course carbon dioxide pollution is affecting our planet's health and our climate. And I also like to try and do some science communication and get out there and talk about these issues. And
of course,
so it was very busy over summer, where we saw the worst air quality in the world being in Australia because of the bushfires. And now we're seeing this really interesting effect where people are obviously wanting to know what's happening to our planet as we go into these this unprecedented time of being everyone, many people self-isolating and reshaping the way that we travel, the way that we work. And we've kind of seen, as you said, we've seen a bit of conflicting evidence there, where so in China, where the major isolation activities started, we saw some huge drops in air pollution over some of the major Chinese cities and industrial hubs. And for instance, so they were cutting back on their electricity use, they were stopping a lot of their steel manufacturing and these very polluting heavy industries. And then as we've seen that spread out across the world, so for instance to Europe, the US and Australia, we've noticed different effects, and it's kind of a lesson in what's creating air pollution in these different countries. And so for instance, in America, I don't know, it's hard to notice if the air is actually cleaner. Maybe it is a little bit in some places. In Europe, it seems like quite a bit of it has dropped, and in Australia, it's done almost nothing. So there's really no scientific evidence that air pollution has actually improved in Australia, despite this dramatic upheaval in the way we live. So if we think people aren't driving, we aren't flying, we're working from home, we're not going into the offices, and it's really interesting to see why that hasn't really done much at all. And I said this to you the other day, we're basically seeing what not to do if we want to cut air pollution in Australia, because if you look at our energy use in terms of electricity, and the electricity that's coming in Victoria from brown coal, and the electricity that's coming from black coal in New South Wales, Queensland, and most of the rest of Australia, hasn't really changed. So we're still maybe we're not powering our office buildings, but we're still heating our homes, which tend to be less efficient. We're we're all working from home, running our computers and all of this other equipment. So that hasn't really changed, and this is a major source of our CO2 emissions, and it's a major source of NOx and other particulate matter and other emissions that affect air quality. We have fewer cars on the road, so we've seen petrol prices have plummeted, right?
Yep.
Because people aren't driving their own personal vehicles, but we still have a lot of freight. So a lot of the things that are using diesel are still out there, and this is for our air quality much more concerning than our modern cars are pretty clean, but trucks running on diesel have more significant problems to actually to produce clean emissions. So that's still going. And then as the temperature plummets, where I know when I go outside during the day, I can smell wood smoke, and that's because everyone's heating, or a lot of people are heating their homes with inefficient wood-fired heaters, and they're doing that now at times where they probably would have been in a efficiently centrally heated office. So, and this is one of the, this is particularly in wintertime, this is one of the big concerns we have around air quality in Australia. It's the particle matter that's coming from people's home wood-fired heaters. And so if you think about coal and diesel and wood as being some of the major causes of air pollution in Australia, they're basically kind of going business as usual at the moment. Yeah. So we've got this kind of a bit of a surprising result there. And as we burn them and make an effect on air quality, we're also making carbon dioxide.
Is it, I guess, potentially, I mean, citizens, us as citizens, like to think that we can, I guess, have some agency over changes we can make on an individual basis. Do you think that we seek, I guess, greater looking air quality in Beijing or LA, as I've seen some photos, as a true marker that we have an inadvertent great benefit of this very, very strange time in our lives? Are we seeking out some comfort just to take away, distract us and move us away from what the greater underlying issues are?
Maybe. I mean, it is nice to see, and certainly in places that have really horrendous air quality, where they've kind of knocked off some of the low-hanging fruit. And I think there's a real movement from people that are subjected to that now see, oh, look, this is what my environment could be like. This is what my everyday experience could be like. That should be a powerful driver to change that. And maybe here we have other lessons that we need to learn.
Yeah, certainly. I'll touch on one brief point before moving on to Emma, but it has been mentioned obviously around Paris targets, for example. So did you want to just briefly explain a little bit, just for the audience, in terms of, I guess, it's a goal for emission reduction. How does that sort of work, and why is that, I guess, largely the benchmark that we attach to as I guess, to understand our achievement year on year in terms of reductions? Yeah,
so from the Paris COP meeting, we now have, going into 2030, a plan for what we need to do if we want to change our CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions, if we want to hit a target of maybe having only 2 degrees of climate of warming into the future, or maybe even very optimistically 1.5 degrees of warming. And we'd be looking at, so when we get out to 2030, we'd be looking at reducing our yearly emissions by something like 20 to 40 gigatons per annum. And this would kind of put our planet on a relatively well-constrained path towards, I mean, it's going to warm, but warming to an extent that we hope that we can deal with. Whereas, we're currently on a trajectory that far exceeds that. Yeah. So we're probably going to see one of the biggest drops in CO2 emissions per year that we've seen in recent times, because these CO2 emissions, even though we're starting to take action against climate change, we're still growing, and our economies are also growing. So we're actually becoming more and more carbon intensive. So our emissions, even though we're taking action, have still been going up. We're probably going to see them drop by maybe 5% or something. Right. People are projecting for 2020, but this could be something like 2 or 3 gigatons of CO2 equivalent less. And even with this factored in, and if you think about all of the, talking about this before, all of the changes that we've made in our lives right now. So if you said at the start of the year, well, what if no one travelled internationally? What if there was no air travel? What if everyone worked from home? What if we stopped using our cars? What would this do? Where would this get us? And it's actually had not a huge impact. So the kind of reduction that we've seen, if we take this out to 2030, we would need to make reductions of similar magnitude year on year. And then we'd probably be getting towards the 2-degree warming target that we have. So we're basically, even if you think about the huge changes we've seen in society, because we're still underpinned by coal-fired electricity for the main part, it's not enough this isn't a magnitude that's actually going to correct the course of our planet's climate.
Yeah. Or at the very least, we've had an inadvertent way to test some of our hypotheses, funnily enough. But
and there's a very, very interesting natural experiment going on right now.
Yeah, for sure. Very meta in all its intentions. But yes, we'll discuss a bit more about, I guess, the evidence-based approaches and how that research potentially shifts in the very near future from your work in Melbourne School of Engineering. So without further ado, Emma, thank you for joining us. Great to see you. So you're involved with smart city projects at City of Melbourne. So tell us a bit about that, and obviously that also entails the Startup Action Plan. It's been you're in the midst of it, and it has been in effect for a number of years now. So what does that mean from a community engagement perspective? Just drop my notes. And what does that mean from a community engagement perspective, and also your role within, I guess, engaging with the citizens of Melbourne from that, project and startup initiative perspective?
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks, Gaz, and really great to be. I'm really humbled actually to be in such a esteemed company. It's really interesting to hear what Sangeetha and Gabriel have to say, because I guess, as you sort of can understand, or Gary alluded to earlier, I'm very much a generalist, by no means ever a subject matter expert in the room today. But I guess I see my role, particularly at the City of Melbourne, in really helping to engage and facilitate innovations that can help solve some of these wild challenges that we have, particularly and specifically at the moment around sustainability. And yes, Gary, we have a startup action plan along with a number of other plans, like our waste and resource recovery strategy, which was endorsed last year, and that's to 2030, as well as our climate change mitigation strategy as well. So there's a number of pieces of work that are going on around the organisation. My role is around smart city projects, and that's, I guess, looking at sort of emerging technologies, but specifically, yes, the Startup Action Plan. And I actually currently sit in the Economic Development branch. So we have a number of sort of, I guess, have a lot of tentacles around the organisation, and sort of, I know we sort of talked a little bit about how governments and universities have sort of that siloed effect. I guess a lot of the work I do tries to break that down. Yeah. So through the Startup Action Plan, we have this Open Innovation Initiative, and that's really around how we can engage our brightest minds in the community, our researchers, our academics, our innovators, community organisations, really the whole ecosystem. How can we find and pull levers that can really create some amazing opportunities and change? Yep. So particularly to this discussion, we're launching our third annual innovation competition, and this year the theme is around waste and the circular economy. So on point here, I mean, we're looking at ways to really eliminate. There's 800,000 tonnes of waste that goes into landfill from the City of Melbourne municipality. That's just in our boundary. That's not looking at Greater Melbourne. So that's a lot. And so really a big focus for us is about how we can become a zero waste city. And through this challenge that we put out to the community, we're really looking for people to come up with some really great concepts and ideas, particularly around the transparency of our whole supply chain, really. Yeah. I think when we were sort of framing this problem statement, really it's not just one aspect. And it's quite a broad challenge where we really need to look at the whole system. And that's really hard to do. So, and it's sort of like, what role does the City of Melbourne have in all of that? And how can we work with other agents and players? So for those of you who haven't heard of Open Innovation, it's like a hackathon, but it's an elongated 6-week-long hackathon. So sort of,
and that's launching soon.
Next Thursday. We're really excited to launch with an event. It's at 4:00. So please give it a search and join in. We've got some great speakers who will be talking about their areas of expertise. We've got Laura Lee Innes. She's an associate professor in environment engineering at Monash. We've got Angela Hoffenagels from Delft, and we've got a local innovator, Caitlin Reid from Reground, who's taking coffee waste basically and putting it into our community gardens. So really trying to get a broad range of perspectives. But the cool thing about Open Innovation is that there's 20 grand up for grabs for our winning team or solution or idea, some other cash prizes, and then we're working with the universities. We've been really grateful for RMIT and the University of Melbourne offering spots into their early stage accelerator programs for some of the winners too. So
yeah, great.
It's just an all round amazing way to kind of get everyone together to solve for something. Yeah.
A Melbourne Accelerator Program and RMIT Activator?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, great. With the, and you mentioned reground, so I know City of Melbourne have obviously been involved in, particularly for citizens to understand in terms of sustainability initiatives. For a lot of us, also our low-hanging fruit, easy to enable, initiative is to begin on the way of utilising keep cups or reusable cups, so that we can obviously make some sort of a difference ourselves. We'll see some really interesting projects and of course many startups working with nascent, emerging technologies submit for that challenge. But also, I wanted to know also, we've been in discussions around the utilisation of data. So I know that City of Melbourne have an open data platform that a lot of people would utilise from time to time. How's that work in regards to public engagement and getting that data available? What's entailed within it briefly, and what is the city looking for people to do with that, both from a university perspective and, project perspective?
Yeah, I think, open data is a big part of this open innovation competition, and we do have an open data platform that has nearly 300 or more data sets now that we can make publicly available for people to download, analyse, have a play with. We've curated a number of data sets that are pertinent to this challenge in particular. For example, the waste we collect per month, the kinds of waste that's processed through our sort of De Graves dehydrating facility down to, it gets really quite specific in some aspects, but we don't have all the answers. And what we try to do through this challenge as well is look at other data and resource bodies that can support us as well. So data.vic, for example, we work with them as well to help curate data sets that come through from Sustainability Victoria, and other bodies as well. And we've been speaking to Oren as well, who I know the universities would be familiar with, the Australian Urban Research Infrastructure Network, and looking at how maybe they can put forward some data that can be utilised by the community as well. So absolutely pertinent to help provide information like data sets and resources. But what this exercise actually really showed us was that there really is a lack of transparency along our supply chains, and part of the challenge is actually how can we collect data better. So I think, I'm really hoping that from this challenge we can start to see some emerging technologies that will help us, maybe sensors, other artificial intelligence, other pieces of technology that can help us really analyse and understand our behaviour and really inspire people to change their behaviour, because you often just, when you think about, you throw things in the bin and then you forget about it and you don't think about where things have come from. So it's all a part of our move to be more circular, and it's definitely a multifaceted piece. So the more data and resources and experts and mentors that we can get on board for these types of challenges, the better. So by all means, if there's any out there, get in touch.
Of course. I'll show the slide again with relevant contact details, but of course you can engage through our social media channels, in particular through Twitter. We'll post some details after the event, including the graphic recording that Zara's working furiously on. I'd imagine, also quite a bit of, that sort of internal engagement and educating, by extension yourselves, throughout the City of Melbourne, to also, I guess, drive perspective on future projects as well is incredibly important. So, that influence would spread far and wide, I'd imagine. I will take that lead then to talk about, collaborative projects and the way that we work together. Sangeetha, would you like to, address in terms of industry engagement? So from your sort of research-based work, but then collaborating externally throughout industry, what have been some recent or some highly important partnerships that have arisen over time that is certainly dictating in the current context our sustainable focus, our emerging projects, and of course, as Emma's referenced, emerging technologies?
Sure, Gary. So I would draw attention to two partnerships that are particularly important and are hosted in our institute. The first one is the Chair of Resilient Melbourne, which is a co-funded project between the University of Melbourne and the City of Melbourne, which has a kind of embedded role for the university to understand how the city is developing a resilience mission, let's say, and also for us to feedback, to input both the kind of research-based, evidence-based knowledge around resilience, but also to be able to feedback how resilience actually works in a institutional context. And that work was led by Professor Lars Kunin and continues, I think, to generate really interesting conversations and a strategic focus on issues like urban reforestation and other projects that identify where universities can collaborate with local government in this view, but also with industry and the community to generate really productive projects around sustainability and resilience. And the other project I would talk about is the one that is based in the Latrobe Valley. So Lars Kunin once again looked at the European Smart Specialisation Strategy. How do we identify in this pathways towards deep decarbonisation, what are the strengths at a community and regional place-based level that help to build emerging revisionings of what a carbon-dependent society can look like. So this involves bringing the Latrobe Valley Authority, so state government, Latrobe Valley Authority, which brings together industry, government and community to work out where their strengths lie. So there are projects on food and fibre, on smart energy, transforming the energy grid. So really leveraging off what are already the social, knowledge-based and technical and economic strengths that the region has in the Latrobe Valley, and getting the region to identify, the community to identify what their vision is for the future, and then to identify how we can actually fund that and make that happen in practical ways.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, we do many things well here in Australia, in Melbourne, within the university, etc. How about some, I suppose, some global exemplars, talking about particular countries or cities that we do use as a reference point? Where do we look to, I guess, within the institute to guide some of the decisions or even some of the experimentation that we'll take with the research or projects that we set in place?
So there has been a tendency, I guess, particularly the sustainable transitions work, a lot of that has come out of Europe. So we have looked to decarbonisation strategies, particularly in Germany, for example. And at a city scale, we look at the city of Freiburg, for example, that has undertaken a wide-scale transformation, done incredible work in buildings and energy efficiency, in urban greening, etc., in bicycle use. So there are European cities that often get held up as the kind of experimental benchmarks in Australia. But I think we also need to recognise the kind of peculiarities and particularities of the Australian context. And I think increasingly we're seeing lots of positive, both social and technological innovation in cities in Asia, and bringing those examples into the Australian context has been quite useful, but also recognising that the challenges in the developing world and in the global south are also quite unique. And issues of, population density, issues of inequalities, and in cities is also demonstrated differently in different places. So we're having to be very conscious of where we take our examples from, and also how we translate our knowledge from say Australia to different geographical contexts.
Yeah, certainly. Well, Emma, I know that we've throughout University of Melbourne, RMIT and City of Melbourne have been working on a Melbourne Innovation Districts partnership, for example. We've been collaborating with internally amongst ourselves on various projects, both private and public. But of course, we do reference within each of our contexts some global cities that we seek to work with, or at least understand a bit more. Have you, I guess, guiding some of your work currently, is there some cities that come to mind that City of Melbourne also refers to in terms of collaborative process or a great lead for emerging projects?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think actually most recently, in thinking about the circular economy piece, I think it was the City of Amsterdam has actually released a really interesting circular economy policy that really looks at donut economics and is actually quite an inspiring piece of work. If you haven't had a look, please, I encourage you to go and have a look at what the City of Amsterdam are doing in this space. But I guess through sort of the Melbourne Innovation Districts partnership, we've sort of had a bit to do with the City of Boston. It's actually a sister city of ours. So we've been really interested in sort of the work they're doing with their own sort of innovation districts, and Mars and Toronto. And I think there's a interesting news that came out this week around Sidewalk Labs pulling out of some of the projects happening over there. So yes, certainly this climate has made things very interesting. So something around the global connectedness piece I will touch on after what you mentioned about Sangeetha was with the Open Innovation Challenge. The first time we tested this was last year. We ran a concurrent competition with the City of Bandung, Indonesia. We've got a bit of a focus around really fostering a better relationship and closer ties with our most immediate neighbours, being Indonesia. So they ran the competition theme last year was safety in the city, and we ran they ran a competition of the same vein, same theme.
Yep.
And we ended up having an international prize element where we selected one of our winners from Melbourne to go to Bandung for a week and conduct market research and meet with local innovators and the government to talk about how they could maybe progress their idea or have a look at their idea in a Indonesian context. And then a winner from the Bandung team actually came over to Melbourne as well, and we sort of did a bit of an exchange. So I think it's really important, and it's interesting. I mean, we can't be travelling at the moment, and when we were drafting up this year's competition, we thought, what are we going to do? Do we have an international element? But in fact, it's more important than ever, and actually easier. We can just have a virtual conversation. So we are still conducting a collaboration with the City of Bandung, and we're going to have sort of a virtual exchange, which will be a number of meetings and facilitated networking online and educational offerings that we can pull together across both cities. So I guess, yeah, it's that's really exciting for us. So we'll continue that collaboration, even though it's a pretty wild time, and hopefully in the next year we can still continue to actually have face-to-face on the ground projects take place in other cities as well.
Yeah, fantastic. I was hoping you'd reference the homeland for a second there, but that's all right.
Our other closest neighbour.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm keeping an eye on them.
Now, I will. We're not wrapping up just yet, but I do want to invite anyone who does have a question. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen on Zoom if you'd like to pose a question, and I'll put that forward to the panelists today. We're about 15 minutes out from getting towards the end. But before we ask some questions, Gabrielle, I want to also address back on that partnerships piece, and particularly with the engagement with industry from a faculty perspective. So Melbourne School of Engineering is very large and vast and has numerous points encompassing engineering. So how is your work dictated by that community? I should say industry engagement, also community gauging for the need for particular projects. But where is that at the moment? And do you see that as having ramped up in particular over the last 12 months, or is that dictated some new decisions on how to collaborate externally?
Yeah, well, we're definitely finding new ways to collaborate and realising that, we can't collaborate in the same ways we used to, or that we need new ways to work. But there's certainly, I can't speak for the whole School of Engineering, but I think certainly each of us as individual academics and researchers know that we can't get by without engaging with industry, engaging with the public to make them aware of what we're doing and why, and also deeply collaborating with our other other researchers, scientists, and engineers. And I think this is something that we've, if I don't want to bang on about my own scientific interests, but I think we have. I mean, we've only got 15 minutes left, so. I think scientists have always been really good at collaborating and sharing data and sharing information, and we know how to do this, and we know how to work together to advance the state of knowledge. And I think this is something that we're also seeing. We can't do these. We can't tackle big problems independently, and I think we certainly, as we've been hearing, we're certainly moving towards that. And it's also, I touched on this before. We're all, I think, now quite personally responsible, and we try and do the best that we can for the environment. But we know to make the major structural changes that we need to, we actually have to pressure, for instance, our local councils, our state governments, and federal governments. We need to get out there and convince our friends, families, and neighbours that this is something that they need to make a priority. And certainly, I mean, you can see the great work that's being done in Melbourne Council. I don't think that would be happening without the pressure being applied from people saying this is what we want. And I think that's really important to seeing a way out of, seeing the deep structural changes we need to get us out of some of the major environmental problems that we're facing.
Certainly, yeah, absolutely. And from that council perspective, I mean, we do strive to, particularly within Melbourne, which is where we're all located. So with that context, but we do strive to have a truly global city, as many of our Australian cities consistently push out there. So important in that is not just the role of technology, but also policy and our approach from a community perspective also. And from that community perspective, and this is open to all of you, so obviously that engagement piece is incredibly important. I'll say from our own context with Melbourne Connect, Science Gallery will be based in Melbourne Connect, and did have a public series of installations last year under a central theme of disposable, and was certainly around what waste means in our lives, but it was predominantly to engage with 15 to 25-year-olds and utilise an art, science and technology combination to engage with the public. And whilst the pieces that were on display in the installations generated much sort of public interest, etc., it does play that really important role in communicating externally and engaging with people and making them think a little bit more. And from that thinking a little bit more perspective, how do you all feel about, I guess, the shifting sentiment in community, in industry, where I guess with the reference to the bushfires at the start of the year, and in particular COVID-19 now, perhaps a much larger shifting appetite for evidence-based research? Have you seen that eventuate much more markedly in the last few months? Because I would say, just from observing through Twitter streams, etc., that people are really trying to sift through and find the truth in the matter, and that allows us to respect the opinions of certified professionals, essentially, rather than sort of clickbait. So a bit of a loaded question there, but I guess, have you seen the shifting sentiment towards evidence-based research and data? And where do you see that influencing the projects upcoming and now?
Maybe I could talk about, so you mentioned the bushfire crisis that we had at the start of the year, which for me was a really, really educating experience, because, I do research in air quality, and it's something that I find I've found it hard to get people in Australia sometimes interested in, whether, we've got clean air, but why do we need to worry about that? And suddenly there was a real need for some scientific expertise and there was a need to get accurate information out to the public, and the public became very educated on, particulate matter and air quality indices and these things that they hadn't thought about before. And I think, and certainly I think we've seen, in the virology experts and public health experts experiencing a very similar thing at the moment.
Sangeetha, how about yourself? What have you sort of recognised, I guess, that need for professionals to allay our fears, to communicate adequately to us about both the context of what we're experiencing at the moment, to understand the role that research plays within that?
So I think there has been a concern that we're in this post-truth world, and particularly on the critical issue of climate change, that the scientific evidence is actually not being taken seriously by leaders at the highest level in the US, also in Australia. And I think people have felt reassured in the COVID-19 experience that there's been a reinforced respect for the role of technical expertise and evidence-based research to guide policy and governance of a crisis. I guess I would obviously, very, very, it's very important to look at evidence-based research. There's another piece that we're particularly interested in, which is how we actually get people to communicate good evidence, good science in a way that's meaningful for communities to take action.
Yeah.
We have the Climate Reality Project hosted in the Institute, which is Al Gore's large vision around science communication on climate change. And we have 1,800 trained climate reality leaders in Australia and also in the region. And there was a big gathering recently in Brisbane last year, about this time last year. And it was very powerful to see how they take this kind of very, the technical, scientific, environmental information, but make it meaningful so that they can activate leadership in their communities. And we had amazing presentations from the mayor of the Torres Strait Islands area, from regional communities in the Hunter Valley, from corporate leaders who are taking this knowledge, but they're making it relevant. And I think that knowledge translation is where there still is a lot more work to be done. And I think that's where there are real gains, because then you empower the community to pressure politicians for real action on climate change.
Yes, certainly. And I think that is, it's a generalist statement about citizens, but we do want to, we do want to understand, I guess, the individual role that we can play, and a base level point that we can take, piece of action we can take is getting educated. So that perhaps points to the reasons why we're placing such emphasis on and importance on the role of research and technical expertise. As well, there has been a bit of a question raised about, I guess, future direction for City Melbourne and particular, or potentially within that Melbourne Innovation District's partnership. But where do we see some new initiatives arising? You mentioned a couple of burgeoning partnerships or projects happening with, was it Oran and Waste Sustainability Initiative? Did you want to touch on those really briefly, just to let the attendees today know what's in the works?
Yeah, I think before I do that, Gaz, I'll just mention as well, this week was meant to be Melbourne Knowledge Week, which is our sort of annual festival of knowledge sharing and ideas, and really just piggybacking off that sort of how to make our research and our knowledge accessible and able to be understood and actioned on by the community. And I think it's unfortunate that we had to cancel the event this year due to the COVID-19 situation, but the Knowledge Week team are still continuing to run really interesting. There's one happening right now, actually.
Right.
Really engaging online virtual events through the knowledge channels. So I would encourage people that to go and check those out, because we are continuing to try and stimulate that dialogue and bring knowledge and information through. I guess, what's coming up? I guess in partnership land, I think initially now we're focusing on this current open innovation competition, and that's really in close partnership with Sustainability Victoria, the universities, and some others. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the next challenge might be. I think there's something to be said around actually using maybe the Melbourne Innovation Districts Partnership to really spearhead a number of smaller challenges or multiple challenges that might engage many partners and many smart minds. So I think we'll focus on the current competition at this stage and hope that we get another Melbourne Knowledge Week ramping up for next year. And the great thing about last year's Knowledge Week, which built off the previous year, was we had a prototype street as well, which was really hands-on, tactile engagement piece for the community. So there'll be a lot of work now going into sort of ramping all of that work up for next year. So I really look forward to working with all of you, actually, on some future projects.
Fantastic. Well, look, I'll ask your parting thoughts now. I'll give you a little bit of lead time on what to look out for and where to direct your attention if you'd like to know a bit more. I do want to acknowledge Felicia for posing the question around most roles in MSSI are in a research capacity. She's a Melbourne Uni student in engineering with a background in business and looking to get involved, which harks to, I guess, a statement around citizens from an individual perspective like to see that they can enforce some small incremental amount of change in some way, whether by research, project, etc. So obviously the Open Innovation Challenge is one example, and internally within the university it is a bit more. But wasn't quite a question, was it? But would you like to leave us with, I guess, something to focus our attention on for the very near future? Start with you, Sangeetha.
Maybe not a particularly concrete thing, but I do think it's really important for us to keep in mind issues of equity as being absolutely central to the sustainability challenge, and how important it is to bring along the communities that might be facing the most direct impacts of a transition. So thinking about coal-producing regions. And we saw in the last federal election what happens when these communities feel like they haven't been engaged and they've been left behind. So I think, the focus on the distribution of benefits from a large-scale sustainable transition and communicating this to a very broad audience is really, really important. And I think everyone at all levels of society has a role to play in that communication project.
Yeah, certainly. It reminds me of something that so Peter Williams from Deloitte had mentioned previously on a previous event around creating, I guess, products. If you're a startup, etc., and it's what's the best type of product to create? Well, ask the community first what they need, establish that need, and then develop from there, rather than just develop blindly and assume uptake. Gabrielle, thank you very much for that, Sangeetha. Gabrielle, did you want to leave us with a parting remark?
Well, I guess I'd like to think that hopefully everyone could just be kind to themselves right now. We're in a pretty tough spot, and I know that a lot of people get anxious about what they can do personally, and you can't do everything, and it's not a problem that we can solve on our own. And and of course we all want to be taking small individual actions, but we also need to be pressuring, for instance, the people that invest our money to be investing it responsibly, your employer to divest from fossil fuels, which includes my employer at the University of Melbourne. We want to be talking to our politicians and protesting and making them aware that we want change, and don't let them think, don't let them enact this responsibilization on us that allows us to think that that we are the problem.
Certainly. Thank you. Yeah, no, absolutely. And Em, last point.
Just echoing everything you've both said just now. It's sometimes it's hard to feel motivated to go and participate. But I'd like to encourage people to keep questioning and keep asking and keep playing the role that they feel that they can, without burning yourself out. I know how much it's hard, even though we're rolling out of bed and jumping online, it's very exhausting at the moment. So just echoing the sentiments, and I hope, I really hope that people can find inspiration to come up with ideas at this time, and to it's never a better time actually when faced with crisis, to really sort of start to think differently.
That's right. Yeah, certainly. Well, look, thank you all so very much. We'll publish out details of your respective works and departments, upcoming open innovation programs, etc. But thank you all very much. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Gary.
Oh, thanks for having us. My pleasure.
True to form, as with every Zoom webinar or meeting, we've gone right up to time and in fact just a little over. So I'm going to wrap it up now. What I will do, I'll just spotlight what Zara's been working on so you can see. So an incredible graphic recording here, which we'll publish out on our social media channels. Zara, thanks again once very much. It looks fantastic.
Awesome.
So this... So that has been Advancing Environmental Sustainability. Thank you all so very much for joining us. Melbourne Connect is running a number of events over the coming weeks online. We will gather again in person, and that public engagement is incredibly important, but it's also important to continue on these types of discussions and bring together people like these from different backgrounds and areas of interest so that we can understand a bit more about the world that we live in. So my name is Gary Williams. Thank you very much. Melbourne Connect has an event next Tuesday, which is part of our Understanding 2020 event stream. It's a collaboration between Melbourne Connect and the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences. And very excited to have Dr. Katie Greenaway talking about the functions of emotions in everyday life, a very relevant and pertinent topic. So without further ado, thank you all so much for joining us again. I went over time, I always do, but really appreciate your attendance. We'll see you all very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.